They laughed at her when she married a poor man who was different from her. They made fun of her choice and didn't think it would work out. But as the years went by, things changed in surprising ways. There was something she knew that they didn't, and the man she married made her life so much better in ways they never expected. Before we jump into the story, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to hear more. Hannah and Nate held hands as they walked out of the big courthouse. Hannah wore a simple white dress, blowing softly around her legs. Her parents had always wanted her to have a fancy wedding, but she didn't need that. She looked at her plain gold ring, feeling so happy, even though she knew they had hard things ahead. "We did it," she whispered to Nate, squeezing his hand. Nate smiled down at her with warm, kind eyes. "We sure did, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice soft. But Hannah could hear the worry hidden in it. Nate looked at her seriously. "Hannah, we need to talk about telling your family." Hannah's stomach twisted with worry. The thought of talking to her dad made her hands shake. "Maybe we could just," she started to say, but Nate shook his head gently. "Hannah, you need to get your things, and they deserve to know, even if they don't understand right away." He held her face in his hands, his touch steady and warm. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, but hiding won't make it better." Hannah closed her eyes, remembering her big, fancy house with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers. She thought of her mom's fancy dinner parties and her dad's friends with all their ideas of who she should be and who she should marry. "They're going to be so mad," she said, opening her eyes to look at Nate. "Dad especially. He always wanted me to marry someone from his club." She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "Someone who looked more like him," Nate finished softly. "White." There was no anger in his voice, just understanding. Hannah nodded, holding back tears. "I don't care about any of that," she said. "I love you, Nate. You're the kindest, hardest working man I've ever known." Nate pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "Then let's face this together. We're family now, and that's what matters." Hannah took a deep breath, feeling braver because of his words. She thought of the medical school acceptance letter in her purse. It was another dream her parents didn't like, but Nate had supported her all along, even working extra hours as a taxi driver to help save for her school fees. "You're right," she said. "We should go now before I lose my nerve." Nate waved down a yellow taxi, and they got in, holding each other's hands tightly as the familiar streets of her childhood began to pass by. Each block they passed got fancier and fancier. "I love you," Hannah whispered as she saw the first signs of her old neighborhood. "That's enough for me, no matter what happens next." Nate squeezed her hand as the cab turned down her parents' long, tree-lined street, with big houses standing tall all around them. Finally, the cab stopped in front of her family's big, fancy house. Hannah felt her heart race as she looked at the familiar stone building and the beautiful gardens. Her mom's rose bushes were in full bloom, their sweet smell floating on the breeze. Nate paid the driver and got out, helping Hannah with her hand in his. "We can do this," he whispered, his thumb rubbing small circles on her hand. Hannah took a shaky breath as they walked up the curved stone path to the big, heavy front door. Her hand shook as she reached for the brass door knocker, but Nate was right beside her, making her feel braver. The door opened, and her dad stood there, dressed in his usual fancy business clothes. His face went from calm to ice cold as soon as he saw Nate. "Hannah," he said, his voice cold, "what is the meaning of this?" Before she could answer, her brother appeared behind their dad, sneering at Nate. "Well, look who's slumming it," he said, looking at Nate's simple suit with disgust. "Did you bring a beggar to our house?" Nate stood silently, his face calm but his jaw clenched tightly. Hannah felt anger rise in her chest. "How dare you?" she shouted. "This is Nate, my husband. We got married this morning." A long silence followed. Her dad's face turned bright red, and then he yelled, Have you lost your mind? I had everything set up with Ryan Henderson's family. Do you even understand what you've given up? His dad's company is worth millions. I don't care about Ryan or his money, Hannah said sharply. I love Nate. Her brother laughed cruelly. Love? What's love going to buy you? Look at him, he probably can't even feed you. Nate stayed calm, but Hannah could feel a slight shake in his hand. Her dad glared at her, his voice full of anger. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? Throwing it all away for nothing? Hannah's heart hurt, but she held her head high. Let's go. Nate, she said, squeezing his hand. We're better off on our own. As they turned to leave, her brother's mocking laughter followed them, and her dad's voice boomed from the door. You've lost everything by choosing nothing, Hannah. Everything. The cab ride back to Nate's small apartment was quiet, with both of them lost in their thoughts. When they got there, Nate helped Hannah with her bags and led her up the 3 flights of stairs. I know it's not much, he said softly as he unlocked the door. The apartment was small but neat, with old but clean furniture and simple decorations. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making the place feel warm and cozy. Hannah looked around at the little kitchen, the small living room with its second-hand couch, and the tiny bedroom. It's perfect, she said, and she meant it. Nate set her bags down, looking tense. I wish I could give you more, he said, his voice sad. They began unpacking her clothes, finding space for them in the small closet and putting her books on the one bookshelf. As they worked, Nate grew quieter, looking worried. Finally, he sat on the edge of the bed, holding his hands together. There's something you should know, he said. My parents weren't always struggling. They used to have a successful grocery store business. Hannah sat beside him, holding his hand, listening closely. Nate's voice shook a little as he kept talking. There was an accident 3 years ago. After they passed away, my aunts and uncles took everything, saying my parents owed them money. When it was all over, I had nothing left, just my car and some savings. That's why I started driving a taxi. Hannah squeezed his hand. Oh, Nate, she whispered. He looked down, frowning. Your dad could give you everything. You're even thinking about giving up medical school because of me, and I can barely afford this apartment. Hannah turned to him, speaking firmly. Listen to me. Yes, I've always dreamed of being a doctor, but being with someone who truly loves me, who sees me for who I am, is worth more than anything. Nate's eyes looked shiny, holding back tears. But your future, he started, but she interrupted him. My future is with you. We'll figure everything else out together. They moved to the small couch in the living room, sitting close. Nate wrapped his arm around Hannah's shoulders, holding her tight. Even though she felt safe with him, Nate's mind was racing. He was thinking about her sacrifices and feeling responsible for her happiness. As night fell and they got ready for bed, Nate watched her brush her hair in the bathroom mirror, feeling a strong love for her and a deep need to help her reach her dreams, no matter what he had to do. The first light of morning peeked through the thin curtains as Nate carefully got out of bed, trying not to wake Hannah. He tiptoed over to his small desk in the corner, where his old laptop sat. The screen's blue glow lit up his face as he started searching online for the cost of going to medical school. When he saw the high numbers, his eyes grew big. The price was very high, but instead of feeling sad, Nate felt even more determined. He pulled up his bank statement, looking at his savings. It wasn't a lot, but he thought it might be enough to buy a decent used cab. Suddenly, the bed creaked, and Nate looked up to see Hannah stretching as she walked over to him. Her hair was a little messy from sleep, but her eyes were bright. You're up early, she said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Nate turned to face her, his expression serious but kind. I've been thinking about your dream of going to medical school. Hannah's smile faded a bit. Nate, we talked about this. No, listen, he interrupted softly, taking her hand in his. I have some savings, not a lot, but enough to buy a cab. If I have my own cab instead of driving someone else's, I can work longer hours and keep all the money. Hannah shook her head. I can't let you do that. It's all the money you have saved. Nate replied firmly, it's an investment in our future, in your future. He pulled her closer, his voice gentle, yet strong. You're going to be an amazing doctor, Hannah. I don't want you to give up on that dream. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. But you'd be working so many hours, and you'll be tired. Nate smiled, gently wiping a tear from her cheek. We'll both work hard together. Hannah sat down next to him, looking at the medical school information on his screen. You really think I can do this? She asked. More than anything, Nate replied, squeezing her hand. You're brilliant, Hannah. You deserve to make your dreams come true. Hannah leaned into him, her voice filled with emotion. I promise I'll study harder than ever. I won't waste this chance. They held each other as the room filled with the soft morning sunlight. Nate kissed her forehead gently. I should go. There's a cab for sale that I want to look at. Later that day, Nate inspected the cab. It had some small dents and scratches, and the yellow paint was faded in some places. But when he turned the key, the engine made a smooth, happy sound. It wasn't fancy, but it felt real. A step closer to making Hannah's dreams come true. Well, old girl, he said, patting the worn dashboard with affection. Looks like it's just you and me tonight. Let's make this count. Nate sat in the driver's seat, adjusted the mirrors, and checked all the dials and buttons to make sure everything worked. The leather seat had a few cracks and creases, showing that other people had used it many times before, but it was still comfortable. As he drove away from the seller's lot, he thought about how he'd calculated the cost for Hannah's school, $50,000 for the first year. 6 months to get started. He whispered to himself, no room for mistakes. The traffic started to thin as night fell, and he drove deep in thought. Streetlights flickered on, making small, bright spots on the road. Nate remembered how Hannah had hugged him tightly that morning and said, I believe in you. Her eyes had been full of pride and hope. He felt determined, checking his GPS to make sure he found the quickest route. Every ride counts, he said to himself as he drove toward the airport. When he reached the airport, he parked his cab in line with the other cabs. He watched a group of drivers gathered near a pillar, laughing and talking. Nate stepped out of his cab, adjusted his new ID badge, and walked over to the group, hoping they'd share tips with him on how to work the airport route. Hi, everyone, he greeted them with a friendly smile. I'm new here. Just started today. The laughter stopped, and 5 pairs of eyes looked at him, not very friendly. A big man with gray hair named Carl stepped forward, crossing his arms. You can't just walk in here and expect to be part of the group, Carl said, his voice gruff. We all had to work hard for our place here. Go find somewhere else to drive. Maybe the suburbs are more your style. Nate felt his face get warm, but he stayed calm. I understand, he said, trying to be respectful. But Carl didn't give him a chance to explain. This isn't some friendly club, Carl said, stepping closer. We don't need any more drivers taking our customers. Nate felt hurt, but he didn't let it show. He nodded, turned, and walked back to his cab with his head held high. Inside his cab, he took a deep breath and held the steering wheel tightly, letting the air conditioner cool him down. Instead of leaving, he drove to a different area of the terminal, away from the group, near the international arrivals. He watched travelers come out with their luggage, some looking very tired, others excited to be home. Finally, a couple came up to his cab, looking happy to find an empty one. Downtown, please, the woman said with a smile as she got in. The Marriott on 4th Street. It's been a long day. Nate felt a rush of happiness. This was his first real ride. He didn't need approval from the other drivers. He had customers who needed a ride, and that's what mattered. The next day, Nate went back to the airport. Even though Carl's words were still on his mind, he didn't let them bother him. He parked in a different spot near the international terminal, away from the other drivers. Soon, a friendly-looking older man came up to his cab. "Rough crowd over there." "Huh?" the man said with a smile. He introduced himself as Jake. "I saw how you handled yourself yesterday. Not everyone would have stayed after that kind of welcome." Nate introduced himself and Jake continued. "I have my own small cab company, been running it for 30 years. I'm looking to retire soon and need someone I can trust to take over some of my regular routes." Nate's interest grew. "Your own company?" he asked, surprised. "It's not big," Jake chuckled, "but I have steady business, some corporate accounts, regular airport rides." He took out a business card. "Come by my office tomorrow morning and we can talk." Nate took the card, feeling grateful. "Thank you, Jake. I'll be there at 9. Jake nodded with a smile. Sometimes the best opportunities come when you least expect them. Later that night, Nate drove home feeling excited. The business card was safe in his pocket, representing new hope. When he opened the door to their apartment, he found Hannah sitting at the table, surrounded by her medical books. She looked up, her face lighting up. "How was your first night?" she asked. Nate dangled the cab keys proudly. "Pretty interesting. Want to see what I invested in?" Hannah jumped up, her face full of excitement. "Yes, show me!" They went down to the parking lot and Nate showed her the cab. He pointed out its features. "It's not new, but it runs great," he said, patting the hood. Hannah smiled. "It's perfect," she said, sliding into the passenger seat, examining everything with excitement. Nate got behind the wheel and told her about meeting Jake. "He's offering me a chance to work with his company," Nate explained, turning the corner carefully as they drove around the neighborhood. Nate was feeling nervous but excited about his big job interview the next day. He had been working hard, and this job would be a great chance for him to earn more money. As he shared his feelings with his girlfriend, Hannah, she clasped her hands together with joy. Her eyes sparkled, and she said, "This is wonderful. A real job means we can have a steady income and plan for the future." Nate nodded and said, "If I get this job, we can start saving for your school tuition more easily. Maybe even set some money aside each month." Hannah reached out, put her hand on his arm, and looked at him with a soft, encouraging smile. "I know you can do this," she said. "You're the hardest working person I know, and you never give up." When they got back to their small apartment, they settled onto their old, comfy couch. The springs creaked a bit as they sat down. Nate took Hannah's hand, feeling grateful for her support. "Thank you for believing in me," he said, his voice full of emotion. "I promise I'll find a way to get you through medical school." Hannah leaned her head on his shoulder, her hair brushing against his neck. They sat together quietly, feeling hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. Through their small window, the morning light painted gentle patterns on the floor, a perfect reminder of the bright future they were working toward. Later that day, as they were out driving, Nate pulled their car into a gas station to fill up the tank. Hannah got out to stretch her legs and breathe in the fresh air. As she looked around, she suddenly noticed a sleek black car pull into the station. It was a fancy, shiny Mercedes, and Hannah's heart skipped a beat as she recognized it. Out of the car stepped Maya, an old friend from Hannah's past. Maya had come from a wealthy family, and she was dressed in a designer outfit, sparkling with jewelry. She looked just as fancy as her car. "Hannah, is that really you?" Maya called out, walking over in her high heels that clicked on the pavement. She wore a wide smile, but there was something sharp in her eyes that didn't feel friendly. Hannah managed to force a polite smile. "Maya, hi," she replied. "Oh, sweetie, I hardly recognized you," Maya said, reaching out and gently touching Hannah's arm. She looked over at Nate's car, her nose wrinkling a little. "Is that a taxi cab you came in?" Hannah tried to respond, but Maya quickly cut her off. "You'll never guess. Ryan and I got married last month. Your father came to the wedding and mentioned he was disappointed that you Maya paused, smiling in a way that wasn't kind. Well, made different choices. Hannah felt her chest tighten, but Maya continued talking about her luxurious life. We just bought an amazing house in the Heights, 5 bedrooms. We'll need them all soon enough, she added, patting her stomach with a proud smile. Ryan's business is doing so well that I barely have to lift a finger. We have staff for everything. As Maya kept talking, each word felt like a tiny arrow hitting Hannah. She glanced over at Nate, who was still filling the gas tank and unaware of the conversation. Hannah forced a polite goodbye, saying, "I should go," and took a step back. Maya's voice dripped with fake concern as she replied, "Of course, darling, take care of yourself. Such a shame about everything." Hannah walked back to the car, her legs feeling heavy. She got in and Nate looked over, noticing her sad expression. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. Hannah tried to smile, saying, "Just ran into an old friend." She looked out the window as they drove home in silence, Clyde watching the city lights flash by. Maya's words echoed in her mind, reminding her of the luxury she could have had. But as they neared their modest apartment, Hannah felt a shift inside. She thought of Nate and his determination to help her achieve her dreams, the way he always looked at her with so much love. It made her realize she had chosen a life that felt right for her heart. The next morning, Nate adjusted his tie, feeling both excited and a little nervous about his interview. Hannah wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "You've got this," she whispered with a reassuring squeeze. Nate hugged her back, feeling grateful for her support. "Thanks, Em. I'll do my best," he said. The drive to the office felt both too long and too short at the same time. When they arrived, Nate took a deep breath, parked the car, and walked inside. The building was clean and professional looking, which made Nate stand a little straighter. In the lobby, his friend Jake was waiting with a big, friendly smile. "Right on time," Jake said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Come on, Mr. Patel's expecting us." They entered a modest office where Mr. Patel, a man in his 60s with a kind but serious face, sat behind a wooden desk. Mr. Patel invited Nate to sit down and they started talking. Nate shared his story honestly, explaining how hard he was willing to work to build a stable future. Mr. Patel listened thoughtfully, nodding as Jake added supportive comments. Finally, Mr. Patel spoke. "We have a position available," he said. "It's a day shift from 9 to 3, driving our regular clients. The pay is fair, and there's room to grow if you prove yourself." Nate's heart beat faster with excitement, but he couldn't help thinking about the extra money they needed for Hannah's tuition. "Would it be possible to work additional hours?" he asked. Mr. Patel leaned back, considering Nate's request. "We keep a strict schedule for our drivers' well-being. 1 shift per driver," he said. Nate felt a little disappointed but nodded respectfully. "I understand, sir. Thank you for the opportunity," he replied, shaking hands with Mr. Patel and Jake. Walking out of the office, Nate felt a mix of emotions. The job was a blessing, providing stable work with a good company, but he still needed to think about how to make up the extra money for Hannah's schooling. Still, he couldn't help but smile, knowing he had taken a step forward in their journey together. As he arrived home, Nate saw Hannah studying at the kitchen table, surrounded by her medical books. She looked up with a warm smile as he walked in. "How was work today?" she asked. Nate sat beside her, sharing stories from his day and telling her about a nice older lady who had given him tips on the best routes through the city. Hannah listened closely, and after a moment, her eyes brightened with an idea. "You know," she said, leaning forward, "you're doing so well with your cab and have extra hours in the afternoon. What if we use some of your earnings to buy another cab? We could rent it out to other drivers. That would bring in extra money even when you're not driving." Nate looked at her, surprised but a little worried. "That sounds like a big risk," he said. "What if something happens to the cab or we can't find reliable drivers?" Hannah took his hand and said gently, "You've learned so much about this business. You know how to spot good drivers and you know how to take care of cars. Plus, Mr. Patel's company has taught you so much already." Nate thought about it, realizing she might be right. He had seen other drivers struggling to find decent cars to rent, and he knew the rates. "Maybe we could start small, look for a decent used cab," he said. "If we're careful, we could still save for your school." Hannah's face lit up with happiness. "Really? You'll think about it?" Nate smiled and said, "More than think about it, I'll start looking right now." He pulled out his phone and started calling dealerships. Hannah wrapped her arms around him in a quick hug. "We make a good team, you know that?" Nate paused, looking at her with gratitude. "Yes, we do," he said. "Thank you for believing in me, Em, and for coming up with such a smart idea." They sat together, feeling hopeful about their plan and their future, grateful for the love and support they shared. Nate tapped his fingers, thinking about his old friend, Max Brown. They grew up on the same street, and Max was always there for him, even though life hadn't given him many chances. After thinking it over, Nate picked up his phone and called Max. "Hey, it's Nate. Got a minute to talk?" Max's voice came through, warm and familiar. "For you, always, brother. What's up?" Nate explained his plan to buy a second taxi, explaining everything carefully. "I know you've been looking for a steady job. This could help us both," he said. Max's voice brightened. "That's perfect timing. I just lost my job at the warehouse last week. When can we meet?" They decided to meet at Friendly's Used Cars the next morning. Nate got there early, but Max was already waiting, dressed neatly in a button-down shirt and slacks. "Look at you. All professional," Nate teased, giving Max a hug. Max grinned. "Had to look the part, right?" They walked around, looking at each taxi carefully. Nate showed Max what to check for: tire wear, mileage, and overall condition. After about an hour, they found a good option, a 3-year-old Toyota with decent mileage and good maintenance records. While the dealer worked on the paperwork, Nate turned serious. "Listen, Max, this isn't just about making money. Hannah's counting on this working out so she can go to medical school. I need to know I can trust you completely." Max looked Nate in the eyes and said, "Nate, you've always looked out for me. I won't let you down. This means as much to me as it does to you." After they finished at the dealership, they headed to Joe's coffee shop around the corner. Over hot coffee, Nate pulled out a notebook. "Here's how it works," he said, writing down numbers. "The monthly fee is fair. You'll still make good money if you work the hours, but I need you to keep the cab clean, maintained, and be on time with payments." Max nodded, listening carefully. "I understand, man. This is a real chance for me, and I want to help you and Hannah succeed." Back in the parking lot, Nate handed Max the keys to the second cab. Nate felt proud seeing both taxis parked side by side. It felt like the start of something bigger than just himself. Max held the keys tightly. "This means a lot, Nate," he said. "I promise I'll work hard and make this worth your trust." Nate patted Max on the shoulder. "I know you will, Max. Let's make this work together." Months passed, and Nate's work became steady. He even got a second job for the evenings. The summer sun was hot as he pulled up to his office at exactly 9 a.m. His day became a routine. Morning shift until 3 p.m., a quick change of clothes, then straight to his evening job as a private driver until late at night. The hours were long, but every dollar brought Hannah closer to her dream. Inside his cab, Nate glanced at a picture of Hannah on the dashboard. She'd been studying harder than ever, with medical books spread across their small kitchen table each night. Her dedication kept him going, even when he felt really tired. "Another day, another step forward," he whispered to himself, checking his phone. Max had already sent his monthly payment right on time. Their partnership was going even better than he'd hoped, with Max taking great care of the cab. After his morning shift, Nate rushed home to change. Hannah looked up from her studies, the medical flashcards spread out around her. Did you eat lunch? She asked, concerned. Grabbed a sandwich on the go, he replied, quickly changing his shirt. How's the studying? Getting there, she smiled, though worry showed on her face. Nate, you're working so hard. He kissed her forehead. And you're working even harder. We're in this together, remember? The evening shift seemed longer than usual as he drove business people around the city. By the time he got back to their apartment at 11:30 p.m., his eyes were heavy with sleep. To his surprise, Hannah was still awake, waiting on the couch. She patted the seat beside her, and Nate sank down gratefully. I couldn't sleep, she said softly, taking his hand. Nate, everything you're doing, all these sacrifices, it means so much. Hey, he interrupted, gently squeezing her hand. This isn't just for you. It's for us, for our future. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. You mean the world to me. Nate pulled her close. In moments like these, all the long hours and exhaustion felt worth it. They sat in comfortable silence, their love and commitment stronger than any challenge. One Wednesday evening, Nate checked his savings account during a quick dinner break, eating a sandwich behind the wheel. His eyes widened. The money was adding up faster than he'd expected. Max's steady payments had become a reliable income, and with Nate's 2 jobs, their goals seemed more reachable with each passing week. He allowed himself a small smile, remembering Hannah's dream. You're making good progress, Hannah said one night, finding him counting the day's earnings. Dark circles showed under her eyes from studying so much, but her smile was still there. Maybe you could take tonight off, just rest. Nate looked up, seeing the concern on her face. I'm okay, honey. Each extra fare gets us closer. I know, but Hannah sat beside him, placing her hand on his. You're pushing yourself so hard. I worry about you. So are you, he replied softly, nodding toward her medical books. We're both working towards something big. The autumn nights got colder, but Nate barely noticed from inside his cab. His world had narrowed to the rhythm of driving, saving, and moments with Hannah. The fallen leaves swirled in his headlights as he drove. After another long shift, Nate climbed the stairs to their apartment, his legs heavy. Hannah was still awake, medical flashcards spread around her. Her hair was tied back in a messy ponytail. I think I'm really getting it, she said, her eyes bright, even though it was late. The professors say I'm showing promise. I want you to know that everything you're doing, I'm going to make it count. Nate sat beside her, holding her hand. That simple gesture held all their dreams and sacrifices. 6 months passed quickly, and soon it was time for Hannah's exam results. Sunlight filtered through their kitchen window as Hannah sat at their small table, her laptop open. Her hands shook a little as she typed in her login information. Nate stood behind her, his warm presence steadying her. The quiet hum of their old fridge was the only sound. Whatever happens, Nate whispered, gently squeezing her shoulder, I'm right here. Hannah took a deep breath and clicked the link. For a moment, she froze, scanning the screen. Then her hand flew to her mouth, tears filling her eyes. I got in, she whispered, then louder. Nate, I got in. Nate hugged her, his heart swelling with pride. I knew you could do it, Hannah. You worked so hard for this. Hannah kept reading, her joy filling the room, but when she reached the section on tuition, her smile faded. Nate, she said softly, worry in her voice. The tuition, it's more than we thought. With books and fees, it's almost $60,000 for the first year alone. She turned to look at him, her eyes filled with concern. Even with all your jobs, I don't know if we can. Hannah, Nate interrupted, pulling up a chair beside her. Remember all those late nights, the extra shifts, Max's payments for the second cab? I've been saving everything. We have enough for your first year, and I'll keep working to cover the rest. But Nate, that's all your savings. One morning, Hannah held Nate's hand tightly. You've worked so hard for so long, she said, looking worried. Nate smiled, squeezing her hand. I'd do it all over again, he said firmly. This is your dream, Hannah, to become a doctor. Don't worry about the money. I've got it covered. Hannah stood up, wrapping her arms around his neck, tears rolling down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered, for believing in me, for working so hard. Nate hugged her back, his own eyes starting to tear up. This is only the beginning, he said, his voice full of love. We're going to make all our dreams come true together. 4 years later, on a warm summer day, Hannah stood outside the big hospital wearing her white doctor's coat. She took a deep breath, looking around happily. She was now a doctor. She had worked so hard, studying late at night, helping people at the hospital and never giving up. Nate had always been there, helping her and cheering her on. And while she worked, he started his own little taxi business, which grew and grew. What began with just 2 cabs had become a fleet of 23 taxis, and everyone in the neighborhood trusted him because he was kind and fair. Nate's company was now a big help to many families in their community. As Hannah stood on the hospital steps, a friend called out to her, "Bye, Dr. Brooks." The title Dr. Brooks still felt new, but she loved it because she'd earned it. The hospital even gave her a job right after she graduated because she was so good at helping people. As she was thinking about all this, she saw Nate walking toward her with a big smile, holding a bunch of bright yellow sunflowers. He looked different in his business suit, but his smile was just the same as it had always been. "Congratulations, Dr. Brooks," he said, handing her the flowers. Hannah's eyes filled with happy tears as she took them. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she whispered, smelling the flowers. Nate gently pulled her close. "You did all the hard work," he said softly. "I just made sure you had the chance to shine." They walked to Nate's car, which was now a nice, regular car instead of a taxi. On the drive home, Hannah noticed the yellow cabs with Brooks Transportation printed on the sides, knowing each one represented a family getting a chance, just like she and Nate had once needed. When they got home, they opened a bottle of champagne. Hannah kicked off her shoes and Nate poured 2 glasses. "Remember our first apartment?" Hannah asked, taking a sip. "How worried we were about everything?" Nate nodded and sat down next to her on the couch. "Look at us now," he said proudly. "You're a doctor, saving lives, and those 23 cabs are helping 23 families start their own dreams." Hannah smiled and raised her glass. "To us," she said, "to dreams that come true." "To dreams that come true," Nate echoed, clinking his glass with hers. A few months later, they had a little baby boy. Hannah watched from the kitchen after coming home from a long shift at the hospital. She saw her son, Oliver, with Nate, who was playing with him. Their new house was cozy and filled with things that reminded them of their journey, like Oliver's tiny clay handprint on the mantle, Nate's first taxi medallion in the study, and Hannah's graduation photo hanging in the living room. Nate picked up Oliver, who laughed with joy. Their little boy had Nate's warm brown eyes and Hannah's gentle smile, a mix of both of them. That day, Hannah had helped a mother at the hospital who couldn't pay for her medicine. Hannah paid for it herself, remembering how hard things had been for her and Nate once, and how people had helped them. Nate's taxi company had now grown to 30 cabs, and he still talked to every new driver before hiring them. He'd recently hired a single mom who needed flexible hours for her kids, saying everyone deserves a chance. He remembered his own struggles and how Jake had once given him a chance. Hannah volunteered at free medical clinics on the weekends, while Nate gave loans to his drivers to help them buy their own cabs. Neighborhood kids loved stopping by their house, where they'd get cookies from Hannah and jokes from Nate. Their home was filled with laughter and warmth. As the sun went down, they sat together on the porch watching Oliver toddle around, chasing butterflies. Nate wrapped his arm around Hannah, who leaned into him. "Remember when we thought we'd never make it?" she asked softly. Nate smiled, watching Oliver try to climb the small maple tree they had planted. "Every minute was worth it," he replied, squeezing her hand. Their house, their jobs, their little boy, everything they had dreamed of was now real. But more than all the things they had, it was their love and support for each other that made them truly happy. One evening, Hannah sat in her favorite chair reading medical journals. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. When Hannah opened the door, she was surprised to see Maya, someone she hadn't seen in years. Maya looked very different. She no longer wore fancy clothes or had her hair perfectly done. Now she looked tired, and her hands were twisting nervously. "Hannah," Maya said, her voice sounding small, "I hope I'm not bothering you." Hannah let her in and noticed Maya looking around her cozy living room. They sat on the sofa, and for a moment no one spoke. "I never thought I'd be here like this," Maya finally said, her voice shaking. "Ryan's business, everything we had, it's all gone. The market crashed, and we lost it all." Tears filled Maya's eyes. "I don't know where else to go," she whispered, looking down. "I know I don't deserve your help, not after how I treated you." Hannah remembered how Maya used to make fun of her and Nate's simple life choices, but she could see that Maya was truly sorry. After a pause, Hannah placed a gentle hand on Maya's shoulder. "Nate and I worked hard for this life," she said. "We started with nothing." Then she added, "Nate's company needs a new manager for the fleet. Ryan could be a good fit." Maya looked up, surprised, her eyes full of gratitude. "Hannah, thank you. After everything, you're so kind." Later that day, Hannah and Nate went to the city market with Oliver. The sun was shining, and the market was lively, with people laughing, chatting, and enjoying the day. Oliver sat on Nate's shoulders, laughing as they moved through the crowd, his giggles blending with the cheerful sounds all around. Hannah smiled as she watched her son play. Sometimes she'd gently steady him when he got too excited. "Look at those apples, buddy," Nate, her husband, said, pointing to a fruit stand nearby. "Should we get some for Mommy's pie?" Across the street, Hannah's dad, Mark, stood still, holding his briefcase tightly. The sight of his daughter's happy family made him feel something deep inside. He noticed Hannah's bright smile and how she looked at Nate with so much love, and the joyful laughter of his grandson. This scene made him think differently about their family, challenging all his old beliefs. Without even thinking, he started to walk towards them, feeling nervous but determined. As he got closer, he saw how Nate carefully lifted their son and placed him in Hannah's arms. The gentle way Nate cared for them showed Mark a lot about him. Taking a deep breath, Mark called out, "Hannah!" His voice shook a bit. Hannah turned around, holding her son close. When she recognized her dad, her eyes grew wide, and she took a small step back. Nate stood steady behind her, giving her a quiet strength. "Dad?" she asked softly, a little unsure. Mark's eyes were fixed on his grandson, who looked back at him with curious, innocent eyes. "He's beautiful," Mark managed to say, his voice full of emotion. I was so wrong, Hannah, about everything." Nate placed a gentle hand on Hannah's shoulder, reassuring her as she looked up at him. Mark's voice continued, "I've missed so much, letting my old ideas get in the way of what really matters, your happiness and this wonderful family you've built." Swallowing hard, he finally asked, Could I hold him?" Hannah hesitated, looking at her dad's outstretched arms. It felt like all the sounds of the busy market faded as she thought about what to do. She looked carefully at his face, seeing real regret in his eyes. Slowly, she stepped forward, saying softly, "His name is Noah," as she gently placed her son in her dad's arms. Mark held Noah carefully, tears gathering in his eyes as the little boy reached up to touch his face. "Hello, Noah," he whispered with a voice full of wonder. Nate wrapped his arm around Hannah's waist, supporting her as they watched this special moment unfold. After a little silence, Hannah took a deep breath. "Would you like to come back to our house, Dad? Maybe we can talk, get to know each other again." The sun was setting as they reached Nate and Hannah's home. The warm light filled their living room, where Mark stood quietly, taking in all the family photos on the walls, the neat medical books, and the toys scattered on the floor, all proof of a life filled with love and hard work. Nate sat in an armchair, holding little Noah, with Hannah sitting close beside him. Mark's hands were clasped as he looked around at the photos. "You've built something wonderful here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He gazed at a wedding photo of Nate and Hannah, which was simple yet full of joy. "I was so wrong about everything." Taking a deep breath, Mark looked directly at both of them. "Nate, Hannah, I owe you both a big apology. I let my old ideas and judgments get in the way. I was so focused on things like money and race that I didn't see what really mattered, your love for each other." Nate held Hannah's hand as Mark continued, looking at him. "Nate, I judged you without even knowing you. I couldn't see past my narrow views to see the kind, hardworking man you are. You've done so much to make a happy home and be a wonderful father to my grandson." Mark turned to Hannah with tears in his eyes. "And Hannah, my dear daughter, I tried to push my own ideas of success onto you. But seeing you now, a respected doctor, a loving mother, and truly happy, I realize you always knew what would make you happy." Mark looked at both of them, wiping away his tears. "I was wrong, and I'm so sorry. Can you forgive me?" Hannah got up, crossed the room, and wrapped her arms around her dad in a tight hug. "Oh, Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with love. Then Mark turned to Nate with a hopeful look. "Nate, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but your family." Nate stood up with Noah in his arms, giving Mark a kind smile. "Family is always welcome here," he said warmly. Mark's voice softened, but it was strong. "I want you to know that I'm proud of the man you are, the husband you've become to my daughter, and the father you are to my grandson. I just wish," he paused, swallowing hard, "I wish I had seen it sooner." Nate's hands relaxed on the steering wheel as he listened, understanding the deep regret in Mark's words. "We all grow and change," Nate replied gently. "It's never too late to see things differently." Mark nodded, looking out at the darkening sky. "You know, I spent my life chasing money, thinking it would make me happy, but seeing what you and Hannah have built together." His voice trailed off, and he shook his head. "These past years without my family have been empty. No amount of money could fill that emptiness." Hannah leaned forward from the back seat, resting a hand on her dad's shoulder. Mark's voice grew thick with feeling. "The way you love and support each other, the happiness in your home, it's worth more than all the money in the world." Nate turned to him with a warm smile. "Noah should know his grandfather. We'd love for you to be a part of our lives." Mark looked at both of them, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'd like that very much. Please, let me make up for lost time. Let me be the father and grandfather I should have been from the beginning." As they got out of the car, Mark hugged Hannah gently, careful not to wake little Noah in her arms. Then he turned to Nate and hugged him tightly, whispering, "Thank you for loving my daughter better than I could have hoped." They watched as Mark got into his car, waving as he drove away. Nate took Hannah's hand and they walked back to their car together, feeling a sense of hope and healing fill their hearts. This was the beginning of a new, happier chapter for their family. If you liked Nate's story, I chose another one just for you. You will really enjoy it. Make sure you don't miss it. Click here to watch it.